How to emigrate. I could see from the comment section of my previous video that there were quite a lot of people who are curious about how to move countries. It's a big topic. I'll try to find a way to help you as much as I can, but please bear in mind that everybody's circumstances is different, and how you will end up in a foreign country kind of depends on partly luck, partly what sort of profile you have, and how you navigate in the immigration process. I would say at a high level, if you're based in a country like UK or some of the European countries and you would like to move to, let's say, Southeast Asia or Australia, because these are the countries that I've lived in, so I'm more familiar with that sort of context. If you're looking at ways to emigrate to the US or South America, sorry, I don't really know how to help you with that. Or even Canada for that matter. I have never been to Canada. I don't know how I can help you emigrate to Canada. But if you're thinking of moving to Southeast Asia or Australia, and these are what I know of the current immigration policy in these few places. So first thing first, let's break that down into a few different categories. I think if you're somebody who's, let's say, white collar with a reasonably decent job, and I can see from the comments that it seems like most of my followers seems to fall into that category, then you have a different way of navigating the immigration process. But if you're somebody, let's say a blue collar, you are a plumber, but you're really hardworking and you just want to move somewhere where the standard of living is a little bit better, where you don't have to struggle as hard to save money, I actually would strongly suggest Australia. Australia is desperately in need of miners. The working conditions are tough, but the pay is pretty good. And you could just work there for a few years, save money, and then you decide whether you want to stay in Australia or move somewhere else. And I would say Australian immigration policy in general is very foreigner friendly. So if you meet what they call the professional criteria, chances are they will welcome you with open arms, especially if you're from, let's say, like a European background. If you're a white collar person, your options are actually pretty good. I would say there are certain professions that are a bit more popular in places like Southeast Asia and Australia, and evolves with time. Right? When I first graduated from university, I graduated as an accounting and psychology major. I knew Australia needed accountants, but because of the timing difference, I decided to come back to Singapore to work instead of staying in Australia and risk 1 year of not getting any employment before I could get my Australian permanent residency. But the rules have changed. I'm not sure if accountant is still on the list of required skill sets. The list of required professions in Australia is very, very clear-cut. You can find them in the Australian government website. I will find the document and put the link below. The thing about Australian immigration is very much state-based. So let's say when I applied for my Australian permanent residency, which I did not end up taking because I ended up in the UK, I applied as a management consultant. And as a management consultant, I could only live in one state in Australia for 2 years, where they gave me a provisional permanent residency. And once I satisfy the requirement of staying in that state for 2 years, I can then apply for a more permanent residency where I'm allowed to live in anywhere in Australia. Most of my friends in Australia were in Melbourne and Sydney, so I would have to sacrifice that 2 years to live in a state that I'm not very familiar with, that I have not even been to, in order to move to a bigger city like Melbourne and Sydney. So that's one way. If your professions fall into any of these required skills in Australia, then this is something you can explore. The Australian immigration policy is quite transparent. You know, when I applied for it, there was they go with the point system. In fact, it was so transparent that UK wanted to follow that system. But in my opinion, UK didn't do it that well, in that it was not very well thought out, even though they have a pretty good template to follow. So what Australian government would look at is what's your profession, what's your age group. The younger you are, the more points you get. What is your English proficiency level, what universities you go to. And when I was applying for my Australian permanent residency, if you graduated from an Australian university, you get some extra points, which was my case. So I would say, yeah, definitely think about Australia as an option. I mean, I personally love my life there. I'm not saying there's no challenges in Australia. If you think that housing in the UK is competitive, wait till you go to Australia. It's like proper cutthroat. But in general, the quality of life is pretty good in Australia, and the weather is amazing. Like, I just love the weather in Australia, and the quality of food is amazing. The challenge will be housing. That's one thing that you have to pay attention to. For those of you who are thinking about moving to Southeast Asia, of course, Singapore is an obvious choice. It's a lot harder to migrate to Singapore just because it's so competitive. Like a lot of people want to move to Singapore. So if there is a job opening here, you have to compete with the locals who are highly educated, and you also have to compete with all the rest of your colleagues who would like to move to Singapore. But I would say don't discount other Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Malaysia, or even Vietnam. Vietnam is booming. Or even Philippines. You know, a colleague of mine actually moved to the Philippines. He's French, but he prefers Philippines than Singapore. One thing about Singapore, Singapore is not for everyone. Singapore has very, very strict rules on recreational. I don't think there are any non-prescriptive recreational that are allowed in Singapore. So if you have the occasional wish to consume them, then Singapore is definitely not your place. And the punishment can be pretty severe. If you like to drink, alcohol can be expensive in Singapore. If you like your green space, then the weather might not be ideal in Singapore for outdoor cycling and running. If you can put up with the hot weather, then fantastic. But if you like to run around in British countryside, then the running around in Singapore is a little bit different. Definitely don't discount places like Malaysia. I mean, I personally think the quality of life in Malaysia nowadays is actually pretty good. And Malaysia are getting very foreigner friendly as well. The work culture is very, very different. I would say if you're just thinking about getting your foot into the door in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines can be a pretty good starting point. So I'll share my personal profile. So I was actually born in Malaysia. Contrary to what a lot of people believe, that I just got the birthright lottery, I did not. I was born in Malaysia as a Malaysian Chinese. So I was a minority in Malaysia, but I was born in a part of Malaysia that's really close to Singapore. So I used to cross the border every single day to go to school. So for those people who say that I got it easy, no. As a teenager, between the age of 13 to 16, I slept precisely for 4 hours and 40 minutes on bed, and then I have to get up at 4:40 in the morning to catch a bus at 5:05 sharp. That basically involves a 1.5 hour commute to school in Singapore, carrying my passport as a teenager. I have to make up for lost sleep on the school bus. And I didn't speak a lot of English at that time because I speak Chinese at home. So I was struggling with my English for the longest time. But my parents actively wanted to send me to school in Singapore because everything was taught in English in Singapore, whereas in the schools in Malaysia, at least the schools that I went to, everything was taught in Chinese. So if I were to go to a university in places like Australia or US or UK, I would be at a disadvantage. So my parents made the conscious effort of sending me to Singapore for school, even though it was really tough. I struggled with the language for, I would say, 4 or 5 years. For the first 4 or 5 years studying in the Singapore secondary school, I wasn't conversant in English. It's only when I went to a really good high school at the age of 17 when I was in Singapore and everybody spoke Queen's English that I realized, oh shit, I'm not gonna get away with speaking Chinese to my friends in school. So I picked up English fast in that 3 months time. So yeah, long story short, I studied in Singapore as a teenager, and then I went to Australia for high school and university. And I got a job offer with PricewaterhouseCoopers in Singapore before I graduated. And then that's when I made the decision to come back to Singapore and work, even though my heart was in Australia at that time. I worked in Singapore for about 15 years, and it came to a stage in my career where I felt like I needed to venture out of Singapore. It fits my nature really well because I always love to travel. I always love to understand more about other culture. On this note, I'll share a little bit about how I managed to get my overseas posting and how I ended up in the UK. My career twist and turn, it was not very linear. At one point, I was working for one of the largest commercial real estate brokerage firms in the world. I was never a broker, and I was a real estate consultant. When I went for interview in that company, the hiring manager knew me anyway because I have been working for about 15 years in Singapore by that time. So he has seen me in networking events, so he knew my profile, and it's almost guaranteed that I'll get the job. Just the interview was really just a formality because he has seen how I work because we were in the same industry. And we still have to do an interview. And in fact, he had 2 questions for me during the interview. And the 2 questions were the deciding factors. The first one is, do I speak Chinese and am I willing to fly? The answer is yes and yes. And I knew by him asking the question, it means I'll be flying a lot to China. China was still a bit of a hardship posting at that time. The information control is still pretty intense, and food security is a problem in China. But I just wanted to get out of Singapore to show it on my CV that I'm not just a Singaporean project person. I can do projects overseas. The China thing was fun. I definitely learned a lot about the Chinese culture, learned a lot about life in general. And after that 1 year in Shanghai, I have the option of either staying in China on a local contract or come back to Singapore. There were a lot of politics going on in that company at that time, and I saw more opportunities for me in Singapore, so I decided to come back to Singapore. But because I worked in China for a year, my colleagues globally knew about me. So I was working for a very small consultancy department, and we have similar departments in Australia, in America, and in London. And I was also hitting my late 30s at that time. I was working like a dog. I was flying every other week. It sounds more glamorous than it is, but when you have to do business travel on economy class, sometimes it's not that fun. And I started thinking about, is this what I wanted to do in my 40s, 50s and above? And I thought, no, I don't really want to do that. And meanwhile, I really missed my life in Australia because I went to Australia for high school and university. And I just thought, okay, let's apply for Australian permanent residency. So long story short, I actually got my Australian permanent residency, and I did tell my colleagues about it. And I really was prepared to move to Australia, start afresh, go there as a permanent residency in Australia without a job, and I start looking for a job in Australia. But I thought, Australia is so far away from everywhere else in the world, so why not go traveling around the world first before I move to Australia, right? And so I thought, yeah, wouldn't it be fun if I travel from Singapore to London by train? So I am actually currently recycling some of my photos and videos from that trip on my personal Instagram profile, and I'll put a link below. And so when my colleagues were freaking out because they thought, no, we don't want you to leave the company. We know that you're stressed out. Is there something we can do for you? And I said, no, I just want to travel around the world. And they say, oh, where are you going? And I said, oh, I'm traveling from Singapore to London by train. And they said, oh, wow, that's really cool. When you're in London, come around and have coffee with us. And I said, yeah, sure. So when I eventually reached London 4 months later, I arranged for coffee with my then former colleagues, and they offered me a job in London. And I thought, well, I don't have a job lined up in Australia. I have a job lined up in London. I've always thought it's impossible to move to London, so I'm going to give that a try. Funny enough, I didn't like London as a tourist. To me, it was very expensive, quite hard to navigate as a tourist. And I thought, well, the job is pretty good. And, I thought, well, let's just take it. So I moved to London. Next thing you know, I was there for 7 years. And because I was in London, my Australian permanent residency lapsed, and that basically expired. So I can't move to Australia anymore. And that's how I ended up working in 3 different countries, as in properly based in 3 different countries. I was traveling so much in that 5 years with the company. I've delivered projects in Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan, Hungary, France, Portugal, Germany. So that was good fun. And that's how I managed to move and emigrate. So I hope this is useful for you. I think every person who emigrate, their stories are slightly different. But the general gist is, if you have, let's say, a professional white-collar job, it's actually much easier for you to navigate. So I hope this is useful. A few things that you might want to consider before you move to other countries. Think about your tax obligation. Think about healthcare. And if you have kids, definitely you need to think about education, because international schools here can be really expensive. And it may not be possible for you to send your kids to local school because of cultural or even the fact that maybe some local schools don't accept foreigners. So these are the 3 areas I would check out if I were thinking about moving to a foreign country. This is a super high level 40,000 feet view, but I hope it at least put together a framework for you to start researching on how you can emigrate to a foreign country, specifically Southeast Asia and Australia. Okay, if you find this useful, please click a like and a subscribe. If you know of any friends who are thinking about emigrating out of their country, you can share this video with them. Also, I'll be quite curious if there are any Singaporeans who are thinking about moving out of Singapore and how I could potentially help. If you're a Singaporean who is thinking about moving out of Singapore, leave a comment below. And if there's enough comments, then maybe I'll do a video about how you as a Singaporean or Malaysian can move to either Australia or Europe or the UK. Okay, have a good day. Bye.